Hi, everyone, and welcome to the New Human Movement. There are few people who inspire me more, and by the way, like where I'm more jealous than people who are deeply innovative, who are creators, who bring new things into existence. And today we have really an innovator extraordinaire with us, Tim Brown. Tim was for many years the CEO of IDEO, one of the most iconic design companies in the world. He remains as the chair of IDEO. Tim has an illustrious history as a designer. He was trained as a designer. You will could find at different times his work in the Design Museum in London, the Metropolitan Museum of Modern Art in New York. He's led countless innovation projects, has written very compellingly about innovation, most recently, A Change by Design, that's 2009, with a new edition out just recently. Would highly, highly recommend that you avail yourself of that book and dig into it. So, Tim, thanks for being with us and having a conversation today about design and innovation.
Oh, it's a great pleasure. Good to see you both.
So, Tim, let me kind of dive in. I mean, obviously, design and design thinking is something that's pretty familiar, I think, to a lot of people now, but maybe not to everybody. So let me just like build a little bit of groundwork for like the next few minutes, and I'm just gonna ask you like some framing questions. So if you had to boil, the whole idea of design thinking, if you had to boil that down to like three kind of key precepts or three key principles, what would they be? Give us the thumbnail sketch if you would.
Well, but before I do that, I wouldn't mind actually just giving you my definition of design because everybody thinks they know design, but it's one of these slightly squirrely terms because, I mean, you ask somebody what's design? I mean, some people will tell you, well, it's the color of my curtains, or what I choose what my clothes look like, and for others, it's about the complexity of designing a new automobile or a new piece of software, and it's actually all of those things. And my preferred definition of design is that whenever we are shaping the world to meet our needs, then we're designing. Whenever we're being intentional about how we want to shape the world, then we're embarking on some kind of design process. And so there are really only two other alternatives. Either the world happens by accident or it happens through science, which is a truth that exists and we have to discover it. So, design, when you think about it that way, is a pretty big topic, right? I mean, it covers an awful lot of what we do in society. It's just that we don't always realize that's what we're doing, that we're designing.
Well, in that
So
sense, I've
if you
often
take
I've
that,
often thought, and let me just say this, Tim. I've often thought that definition is so broad it encompasses everything, and I guess, or almost everything. I guess what you're going to say is, but you can do this better or worse, right?
but that's the
Intentionality
point.
is not enough.
Exactly. Intentionality is where you start, right? And then you have to have an approach. I think of it as a kind of, when I use the term design thinking, that for me is a little portfolio of mindsets and methods that allows you to be intentional about the way the world gets shaped in a way that hopefully produces decent results. Um, and so there are some kind of core principles about design thinking. I mean, if we're shaping the world to meet our needs, then by nature it has to be human centered, and we have to think about people first, and then build the systems and business models and apply the technologies we need in order to meet needs, not start the other way around, which is actually what happens a lot in business. Hey, we've got this business model. What can we use? What can we produce with it that people might want? So it's human centered. It's iterative. I mean, design is never right first time, and therefore, when we embark on a design process, we have to be prepared to fail and to discover and learn and pivot and redesign. Um, and perhaps most importantly, it's not an intellectual exercise. Design is the art of taking ideas and then making them and creating them. And so we have to have this bias towards action, this bias towards making. So these principles, you could think of those as mindsets, if you like. And then there are really just three buckets of activity that are involved in design thinking. One is, where do we get our ideas from? What inspires us to have ideas? That's mostly about getting out into the world and discovering, being curious, um, getting in front of real people, watching real people, seeing how real people behave, seeing how organizations behave, and not relying on sort of third party information to do that. We can get into a debate about about the value of things like focus groups, but in general, things like that are not as helpful as getting out into people's homes, their offices, their lives. The second bucket is how we imagine. How do we bring ideas out of the mist, the kind of depth of our imagination or a group's imagination and make them real? And for that, we use all of the kinds of skills that have been developed by visual thinkers and makers over centuries. We draw, we act things out, we build frameworks, but we prototype, we try something out, and even something as complex and abstract as an organization that we might be trying to work on the design of, we want to find ways of prototyping and making as early as possible. And then finally, of course, we've got to actually execute. And so that third bucket is when we start to bring in. It's why the best design is often so very multidisciplinary, because we have to bring in all of the skills of marketing, of engineering, of operations, and have them flow into the design process, so that when we come out of the far end, whether it be a new product or a service or an organization, whatever it is we might be working on, everything works, right? Everything's ready, as it were, for the market.
So Tim, let me dig in a couple of things that just immediately occur as you go through that. Living where you live, where I live here in the Bay Area in California, I've often felt there's this kind of what do I want to call it? There's almost an idolatry of innovation or of innovators. Let me be more clear. And there's this sense that, there's these few extraordinary, and they certainly are extraordinary people like Elon Musk or Steve Jobs or, pick your whatever, but that somehow this capacity, as you say, to imagine, to realize is imbued, God gives that genetic gift to a very few people. And yet, you're describing this more as a discipline or as a set of attitudes that can be learned and taught. So how do you square that up? What part of this is, some genetic gift, and what part of this is a set of skills and aptitudes, attitudes that, you can learn?
Well, I like to use a bit of a comparison. It's not really an analogy. It's another discipline which we're quite used to, that for which the same is true. You think about writing, right? Now we have Nobel laureate writers. We have everybody from William Shakespeare down, right? Who are of the kind of class of writer that 99.999% of the rest of us can never aspire to be. And I think of Steve Jobs and Elon Musk as being a little bit like the Shakespeares of the innovation world. But there are, below that or alongside that, there's a host of writers who make their living as writers. They may not win a prize, but whether they're journalists or technical writers or marketing writers, they're professional writers. And then beyond that, there's almost all of us that use writing in order to communicate. And if we didn't have writing available to us, our world would be a poorer place, and indeed it would be an impossible place to navigate. And I think of design in the same way, that the capacity for design to bring new ideas into the world, if we all had a facility for it, would be so much greater than if we just imagine. And I mean, design and innovation. We can with this conversation, maybe we can use the two terms a little bit interchangeably. But if this ability to think of new ideas and bring them into the world, if we all have that facility, then the total capacity of humanity to advance our cause would be so much greater than if we just rely on the equivalents of William Shakespeare to do the only writing that we have available to us.
So, Tim, that's an amazingly good segue. I want to quote something. I'm going to read something out of your most recent book, Change by Design. This is what you said. You said, it's hard to imagine a time when the challenges we face so vastly exceed the creative resources that we've brought to bear on them, which is easy to see when you think of climate change and global warming and racial disparities and income inequality and so on, and pandemics and so on. And then you go on to say, what we need is an approach to innovation that's powerful, effective, and accessible, that can be integrated into all aspects of business and society. In other words, not just a design firm sitting out here somewhere that can do this as a special thing, but integrated into everything that individuals and teams can use to generate breakthrough ideas that are implemented and have impact. So let's transition to that for a moment, and let me throw out a couple of data points that you would be familiar with. So I think most leaders today, most corporate and other organizational leaders, they get why innovation is important. They understand that it's the only insurance against irrelevance. It's the only way to guarantee long-term customer loyalty. It's the only way to outperform the average. So, BCG survey says 69% of all CEOs rate innovation as a top priority. So I think people get that. But then when you look at other data from McKinsey, 94% of leaders are pretty dissatisfied with the innovation performance of their organizations. So like what's this gap? Because you're saying we have these tools, there is this innate capacity that all of us have, and yet somehow the rubber isn't meeting the road, right? We're not, the gears that would turn that creative potential into creative accomplishment, whatever those gears are, like they're missing, they're broken, something else. How, help us understand that.
Well, I think we've got something missing at multiple levels. To be honest with you, I think at the yes, I genuinely believe we all have the capacity to contribute to innovation, participate in innovation, to innovate, and we don't need to be a scientific genius to do it, or a business genius to do it. However, while I believe we have those innate skills, we do a very, very poor job of unlocking those skills in the vast majority of people, starting right the way back in K-12 education. We ignore those kinds of creative skills in favor of other kinds of academic skills, which are all, of course, important. But we have largely focused on giving ourselves the sort of analytical skills that the Industrial Revolution required in order for us to be effective in the industrial workplace, including in what I think of as the industrial knowledge workplace of the late 20th century, where analytical thinking was, where as human beings we were largely acting as machines, where the focus was on efficiency, not creativity. We've developed those skills, and we've developed the mechanisms for embedding those skills in our education system. We have not in any way significantly focused on embedding the skills of innovation and creativity in the vast majority of folks coming out of our education system, whether that's K-12 or college. So that's one problem. Second problem, when you get into the organization, is that again, we spend almost all of our time focusing on the efficiency of the organization, and one of the kind of interesting side effects of this, and I think to be honest, this point of view has been largely inspired by your thinking. For me, is that the bureaucracy that comes along with that focus on efficiency, which requires all of this internal communication to go on within the organization, means that the way we use our time prevents us innovating. So, many of the organizations I work in, the idea of trying to get somebody at almost any level in the organization dedicate more than 10% of their time in any given week to a creative project is almost zero. And yet we know, as people who spend all our time innovating and designing, we need to spend 90% of our time in any given week on that project if it's going to have significant results. Not 10%, 90%. And so there's this enormous gap within the way that we operate our organizations that makes, if you like, the time to think, the time to create, the time to explore almost impossible to access. And so this combination of lack of skill, which means we have lack of confidence. My colleague, David Kelly, talks about this idea of creative confidence, which is the combination of the ability to have ideas and the confidence to act on them. is missing in the vast majority of people in our organizations. And then we put them in a situation where there's never the time, structured or unstructured, to actually do anything innovative.
Yeah, I mean, what you're describing, it seems to me, Tim, is just I have to say it's a lack of seriousness, right? And so you can put all these other barriers in the way, but I'll give you my analogy. And sorry to the listeners, I might have used this little example in one of our other episodes. But I talk to a lot of CEOs who tell me they're very serious about innovation. So I said, well, really, let's go do a little test. So you go down to front lines, people across the organization. You ask them three questions: have you been trained in design thinking? Have you been trained to think like an innovator? Has anybody invested in your creative capacity? No. All right. If you have a potential idea, is it relatively easy, to your point, Tim, to carve out the time, not forever, but you need a month, you need to advance it. How easy is it to get a time and a very small amount of budget to move this thing forward? And the answer is I wouldn't even know how to do that, right? Like there's no way to carve that out. And then the third question is it clear to you that your leader, whoever that is, your boss, they're accountable for innovation, that they're tracking number of ideas, number of experiments, and so on. Like, no, we don't really ever talk about that. So then I have to go back to the CEO and said, you told me you were serious, but you don't train people, you don't make it easy, and you don't hold people accountable. Like, I don't know how you define serious, but that's not my definition. And I think, I mean, so let me come back and say, like, how, because just as you said, you said in your book that we have this huge gap now between the size of the problems we're up against and our capacity to mobilize creatively to tackle those problems. But I would also argue in every organization you see this great gap between, at least rhetorically, how important we think innovation is, but how seriously we're actually is it the fact that executives aren't really serious, or is the challenge they've never really seen design thinking scaled up. They've never really seen it as something that's embedded and institutionalized. And so they just can't imagine, how to make that jump from one person with a bunch of creative tools to an organization that is, institutionalized. I mean, yeah.
Yes, both. It's probably true. They have neither seen it nor do they necessarily know how to do it, other than a few, visionary CEOs who have made valiant and in some cases quite effective efforts to do so. I'm thinking of people like Jim Hackett when he took over as CEO of Ford, who was already a strong believer in design thinking, and I've had the pleasure of working with him for decades. But when he moved to Ford, he saw a design organization which was a typically siloed design organization within an automotive company, working on the styling of the trucks and vehicles that Ford made. But what he was interested in is bringing design to almost every aspect, or design thinking and innovation to every aspect of what Ford was doing, particularly as its future was getting disrupted through electrification and automation. And so, through his efforts, he firstly created another place for this kind of work to start happening outside of the normal product organization. He created this thing called Greenfield Labs, named after Henry Ford's little place in Michigan, and then
Greenfield
so
Village, yeah.
that was yeah, exactly, named after Greenfield Village. Started Greenfield Labs initially in Palo Alto, and then spread it to the UK, to Detroit and beyond. And then slowly took the approach that mostly focused on new mobility services and electrification and automation, and then took that approach and then inserted it back into the product lines over time, so that you started seeing things showing up. And now you look at the electric F-150, or even the ICE F-150, that's got all kinds of features on it now that recognize the real needs of the users of those trucks that didn't exist, a couple of generations ago, which is making the truck even more popular than it already was. Or you look at the new Bronco, or you look at some of the other more conventional product lines. And the number of people involved in design thinking across Ford has exploded over the last 7 or 8 years. So that's just one example, but it does take a lot of effort. It's doable.
by the way, I would encourage. I mean, it's interesting you just connected those dots for me, Tim, because I looked at the new Lightning 150 pickup, the electric pickup from Ford, and really watched people walk through that. I mean, the number of like beautiful design ideas in that thing is extraordinary. I mean, you could just tell there was a care and a thoughtfulness and a user obsession there that I would say has probably not been typical of Ford or maybe any car maker. So, yeah. So, all right. So you're saying, but it's still, I guess you'd admit it's still pretty rare.
Oh, it's totally. I mean, it's extreme. It's extremely rare. And there's a something in our human nature, isn't there, which is it's very hard to stop doing what we're doing in order to do something new that appears to be risky or that we don't understand. So there's this basic psychological problem that I think leaders have, and it takes I think it's taken a lot of bravery or a lot of vision from leaders to say, no, this isn't good enough. We have to carve out time. I personally, as a leader, have to get involved, not because I've got the best ideas, but because I need to support and enable the people that are innovating. I need to show that I'm committed to it. As the burden on CEOs gets ever greater with the number of different things that they have to pay attention to, that job that releasing that time to do that is probably getting harder and harder, not easier.
So, Tim, I wanted to follow up on what you just said because there's no doubt that building a deep capacity for creativity in an organization requires a lot of conviction, a lot of hard work, and a lot of time. And it reminds me of Intuit, a company that we describe in Humanocracy. They're a financial software services provider. They're the makers of QuickBooks and TurboTax, among other things. And the chairman of Intuit and the founder of Intuit, Scott Cook, has long been committed to embedding creative practices inside the company. For instance, by having every employee go through a design thinking training program, carving out 10% of people's times for innovation and experimentation, and supporting this experimentation with funding and mentorship and so on. And putting all this infrastructure in place takes a lot of time and effort, no doubt. But perhaps you can comment on a couple of other reasons for why this kind of innovation capacity is all too rare in our organizations. The first is that a lot of CEOs and executives simply may not believe that creative capacity is broadly distributed across the employee population. That is, there are only so many people that are really creative and innovative, and so supporting this more broadly isn't very fruitful. And some people might even argue that expecting employees to innovate is a bad idea since it distracts them from delivering on operations and keeping their heads down and turning the crank. So that's one potential reason. The other is that, to be honest, there are several other ways in which a company could juice up performance, at least in the short term, that are easier to pursue, right, than building this kind of innovation and creativity infrastructure. You can embark on an acquisition spree, become a bigger company with more market and regulatory leverage, and basically avoid the hard work on delivering growth. So I was hoping you could comment on these two potential explanations and let us know what you think.
I think it's perfectly reasonable to say that, of all the things that leaders can do to create growth and create competitive advantage, building innovation capacity is one of the harder of them. I'm no expert in management theory. I bow to each of you around that, and I'm certainly no expert in some of the other activities that CEOs get up to, like mergers and acquisitions. But from what I can tell, ultimately many of those efforts turn out to be not to shareholders' advantage over the long haul. And while the CEO may not have a long-term view, and indeed many shareholders don't have a long-term view, many do, or at least some do. And I think if you look at the long-term performance of organizations, those that have a healthy innovation capacity do better over the long haul. I mean, I was just reading, I think just yesterday, and Tim Cook, I think, is believed to be now the CEO that's brought the most shareholder value to a company in history. He has not done that by spending his time cutting costs or through mergers and acquisitions, right? He's done it by continuing to deliver innovative products and services to market. Following in the footsteps of Steve Jobs. Um, and you look at other companies, like Nike, like Intuit, um, you know, uh, uh, and the list like Google. The list goes on and on, where innovation, bringing new things to market, is part of the is part. I mean, it's not the only thing, but it's part of the ethos of the organization. So yes, it's hard, but the evidence is pretty striking that when it's done well, it provides long-term and significant growth and significant shareholder value.
I hope you're enjoying the conversation, and there's a lot more to come. I just wanted to take a moment to thank Hire for supporting the work of the New Human Movement and underwriting the costs of producing this video. Our goal is to spur a revolution in leadership, organization, and work. And in that endeavor, Hire has been an extraordinarily reliable and inspiring partner. Now, back to our conversation. Yeah, I don't think there's any doubt about that, which makes it kind of all the more interesting or worrying that it's so rare. Michele mentioned Intuit there for a moment. Let me see if I can bring up I mean, if you look at, in fact, I was just looking at them this morning. If you look at them actually over at Intuit over the last 10 years, I think their share price is up by more than 600%. Which is way higher than the Dow Jones Industrial Average. And it's one of the few companies. I mean, we've done this work in a few companies, and I can point to a few successes, but there are not many organizations that have kind of taken this kind of, as you're describing it, Tim, this more systematic approach where they call it design for delight, but like they teach every employee how to think. The principles of design thinking. They give everybody a certain amount of time to like work on the stuff that's not part of your day job. They make it pretty easy if you have a halfway decent idea to get a quick team built around that and get some real dedicated time to dig in. They've trained hundreds, thousands of people actually as kind of mentors and catalysts. So, you can go and find a coach to help you in all of this. Every leader at every level is expected to be sponsoring new projects at Intuit. They have dedicated budgets set aside, so you're not trying to scrimp out of existing budgets. And HR and finance, all the key staff groups, they've said, listen, you guys got to help this kind of experimentation and not get in the way of it. So legal, make it simple for them to go out. But it's extraordinary to me, Tim. Companies do difficult things. They do systemic things. Companies spend, 15 years re-engineering all the supply chains, logistics, and so on. It's not like they don't know how to do something that's like hard and systemic.
Yeah.
But there's some kind of a block here. Mhm.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, one thing that's always interested me about. I mean, I spent lots of time with Scott, uh, uh, being involved to some degree in some of that work that you just talked about. But there's something that was interesting to me, which is that Scott wasn't the CEO of Intuit when he made most of that happen, right? He was already the chair. So one strategy, I haven't really thought about it a lot, but I mean, this is something you might have a point of view on, which is, I mean, it part of the problem is simply the capacity of the CEO, and yet we need high level support to get these kinds of shifts in culture and shifts in ethos to happen. So, and it doesn't work for the CEO to go down, look down 3 levels in the organization and say, you mid-level leader, it's your job to make, innovation work across the company. That never works. But there was something interesting about the fact that Scott did have the capacity. It was the thing that he focused on as chair of the company, while I think, more than one CEO actually over a period of time, focused perhaps on some of the more kind of operational pieces of it. And I wonder if more creative strategies at the most senior leadership levels of organizations might not result in some shifts here. This is, again, much more your area of expertise than mine, but I mean, it's an interesting thought.
I had that exact thought a moment ago when you were talking, is that maybe one of the problems is there's a lot of leaders who lack their own creative confidence.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so you don't understand it as a process, as a discipline. You probably undervalue it. I mean, when I'm in a mean mood, I sometimes say, there there are a lot of leaders, a lot of them who come through the business school, sadly, who have like, a left brain the size of a watermelon and the right brain the size of a walnut. But if you don't have that creative confidence yourself, it's hard to probably instill it in others.
Yeah, I mean, one of the most interesting sort of leadership experiences I had in my career was many years ago now, working with A.G. Lafley when he was CEO of P&G, and he wanted to establish this kind of design enabled innovation culture across all of the businesses at P&G. This is back in the early 2000s. And one of the things that he did, because he believed this in the same thing, that leadership needed to support this idea, he brought the top 35 or 40 executives from P&G out to see us at IDEO for several years in a row to come and all of them to come and get involved in understanding the innovation process and the design process. And we took them out on design research. We took them out doing prototyping. And this is everybody. I mean, interestingly enough, one of those people back then, who was this then CFO, I think, or at least one of the senior execs anyway, of P&G was Paul Polman. Paul was in that group. I think it influenced his point of view about how to think creatively in an
Who then became
organization.
chairman of
then went.
Unilever. We need to add, yeah.
Well, he went to Nestle first, and then Unilever, and has been a spectacular leader in terms of disruption and change that I think we all look to as being a great example. But I'm sure our influence was tiny, but it shows that it's really worth exposing leaders, even if their role is not one we would necessarily think of as being an innovation role.
So, Tim, without a doubt, having enlightened leadership can make a really big difference. But sadly, I don't think we have a sufficient number of such leaders to make a systemic impact, to really make a dent. What do you think is required to move the needle? Do we need to think much more boldly and have something like a Manhattan Project style effort that builds creative capacity across the ranks of executives and employees more broadly? Is something like that what we need?
Yeah, I mean, the part of the problem, of course, and this is what we've just been talking about, we need a massive remedial program in innovation and design thinking to happen across corporate America, to make up for that lack of exposure and education that most have had. I mean, we're starting to see more and more business schools, thankfully, introduce more in the way of innovation and design thinking into their curriculum. It's still pretty small compared to all of the finance courses everybody gets to take, but it's a start. But I think we need that massive program. And so, I'll go back to the example of Jim Hackett at Ford. He put together a pretty significant education program of online and other kinds of experiences to encourage and educate more and more executives. Another one of my kind of favorite kind of collaborators around innovation and design over the years has been a fellow by the name of Carlos Rodriguez Pastor. I don't know if you've ever met Carlos, but he is one of the most successful businessmen in Peru, his company Intercorp has been extremely successful at introducing design thinking across the many, many businesses, and some really disruptive innovation in very surprising places, including education and healthcare, as well as his core businesses like banking and retail. But again, he has his leaders go through kind of innovation experiences on a regular basis. Every year, he takes them out on visits to different parts of the world to explore new users and new markets, and has been religious in making sure that his team continues to get exposed to new thinking and new ideas. And I think that's just one of the things that you need, for these kind of Manhattan style efforts and the project style efforts. They need consistency over time, and it needs to be widespread.
And speaking of business school curriculum, it seems to me, Tim, that most management training has traditionally focused on helping leaders develop a particular portfolio of cognitive skills, left brain thinking, deductive reasoning, analytical problem solving, and solutions engineering. So if we are really serious about building creative capacity, it seems to me business schools must redesign training programs to help executives develop a new set of skills, completely different set of skills. And this might require a fairly big overhaul. How might this look like in practice, do you think? Are there any examples we can learn from?
Well, I mean, a very interesting example is the D School at Stanford, right? I mean, so because one of the problems with business school education is largely case driven, right? So it's about reflecting on what another organization did, and it's a great learning, a kind of a learning tool. But innovation and building innovation confidence is all about making things. It's all about going through. When I went to design school, really all design school is about is having you do project after project after project after project. So that by the time you've gone through, in my case, 7 years of design school, I'd done dozens and dozens of these things. So I had some level of comfort with the process. And reviewing cases doesn't get you that. And so what I think the success of the D School has at Stanford has been it brings people from the business school, from the engineering school, from other parts of the organization to come together and do projects together. And the number of startups, Silicon Valley startups that have come from folks who've met doing D School projects as part of their MBA or part of their computer science degree is huge. And so I think that model making sure that folks who are studying for MBAs are doing hands-on projects, preferably with other disciplines outside the business school as part of their business school experience, I think is one relatively small step, but I think it'd be very influential.
That's actually a fantastic idea, Tim. I'm going to talk to the dean at London Business School. That's a very, very good idea. Let me come back though to this conversation you were having about kind of immersing people, and particularly leaders, others, immersing them in the disciplines, taking them out into the field. All those people from Ford coming in and learning from IDEO. I've always thought about this problem as having two aspects. There's an individual aspect, which is building the skills, building the competence, building the ability to kind of see around corners and imagine the future. And that there are ways of teaching people, as you know so well, and helping people get better at it. But it seems to me there's also the institutional side of it, because what I've often found is, you can train people, you put them on projects, and yet, when the project disappears or they go back from IDEO back into the organization, they're back in an environment where the structures, the reward systems, the way time is used, none of that supports, what you're trying to teach them. And so, I won't belabor this, but in a couple of organizations where we had actually quite some success, we kind of took, a page out of the re-engineering playbook, but with a big twist. We said, okay, rather than re-engineering your operating model for efficiency, what would happen if we re-engineered the management model for innovation? And so a project we did, Michele and I did not so long ago with Adidas in North America, we said, well, we kind of know what are the principles of building a high innovation environment. You need freedom, you need time, you need a sense of ownership, you need these creative disciplines. And so we literally asked several thousand employees to start to hack the management model. So, if these are the important principles, time, curiosity, diversity, and so on, okay, now look at how we allocate capital, how we plan, how we hire people, how we staff projects. What would you start to change if you wanted that innovation to be an everyday thing baked into our genome and not the special project or the cool kids or, once in a while activity? And it was actually pretty interesting. Michele will remember the number. We got thousands of hacks, and then we had them peer review, and then we started. But I think it's just interesting that, and I think partly is because innovation has been seen as this kind of almost ephemeral, magical kind of thing. The idea that you can kind of institutionally support it in some fairly, disciplined ways. Like in one organization, we made innovation the largest component of long-term executive compensation, because this is what drives share price performance. And I just think a lot of leaders somehow haven't.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, if you think about it, we have a model for managing knowledge in academia. You think about the publishing model. That was all of the rewards, incentives of universities set up around publishing of what over hundreds of years has achieved enormous amounts of new knowledge in the world. We have knowledge systems, management systems, incentive systems built around being operationally efficient. That's what business has done so well. We do not have the equivalent for innovation and creativity. And you're absolutely right. It has been and been considered to be some mysterious art form, and I think it's time. I mean, I'm really glad that you're working on it, because it's time that we had more than just our intuition to go on when it comes to orienting our organizations around innovation. I do think that there's some things we have discovered. If you're working on incentives, I think that's really important. I think there are modes and styles of leadership that also have to change in order to in order to encourage innovation. The idea that that leaders are the people with the answers is not supportive of innovation. It does not empower others to innovate when they believe that the boss 3 levels up is going to have their view of the answer no matter what work you do, and the answer is going to come back down at you with no without you having any control. Instead, leadership, in my view, becomes a sort of a dance between multiple modes. But what we need leaders to have in organizations that are oriented around innovation is not the answers. We need leaders to have the best questions. We need leaders to inspire curiosity and discovery by asking deep, insightful questions that send the organization off in interesting directions. I have this metaphor of the explorer, the sort of explorer who stands on the beach looking at the horizon, saying, what is the other end? What is the other side of that horizon? What happens when we go in that direction? And then, the resources, people jump on boats and off they go. And so there's that style of part of the kind of the leadership equation. I think, innovation leaders need to be also much, much better at standing behind their people, kind of nurturing and gardening, if you will, the culture and resources of the organization to be supportive of creativity and innovation. But there's a third mode, which I think is what actually scares a lot of leaders today, which is, I describe it as the player coach, right? That to be a credible leader today in an organization that wants to be oriented around innovation, you have to have enough experience of it yourself to be able to stand alongside teams and help them. And if you do not have that credibility, then I think it damages the effectiveness of teams, and means that they often kind of wander around in the wilderness for a lot longer than they should. So, when Jim Hackett would turn up at a review of projects, he would be there coaching the teams. He wouldn't be saying yes, no. He would be there coaching the teams on how to do better. Similarly, Carlos Rodriguez Pastor, as I mentioned a little bit earlier from Intercorp, he does the same thing. I think great leaders know how to coach innovation.
Yeah. I think that's a very important point. It's kind of the opposite. The classic horror story is the automotive CEO who came up through finance, coming down to the design studio and saying, "I don't like that." Right? I mean,
right. Exactly.
Tim, I'd like to shift our focus from retooling an individual organization or company to having an impact at the broader, systemic level. Design thinking, and a lot of your work in particular, is really focused on this, since thorny, complicated problems such as reinventing management and leadership, for instance, involve multiple players, both in generating the problem to begin with, as well as in identifying and implementing potential solutions. So I'd love to get your perspective on what it takes to do system-level change successfully. What are the success stories? What are the key role models? And what can we learn from both individual actors as well as institutions that are really driving this kind of change?
My journey of discovery around systems-level change is that we actually need to do a whole bunch of things differently. And that it's not, unfortunately, you can't take the point of view of innovation and change that says, okay, I'm going to create a new product or a new service and enter a new market, and then just scale that up in order to take on systems, because the nature of systems is different from the nature of these more definable kind of individual things like a product or a technology. Systems have certain qualities. Obviously they're highly complex. You don't get to stop a system and restart and build a new one from a blank sheet of paper. This sort of modernism, this idea of like tabula rasa, starting from a blank sheet of paper, does not apply to systems. You can't do it. You've literally got to be changing the wheels while the thing's going along at 60 miles an hour. So you have to intervene in systems. You don't get to design a totally new system. And so because of that, and because they're so complex, you have to understand where the leverage points are. You have to understand where to go and insert the effort into the system that's going to have impact. And we don't really necessarily have the best tools to do that today. A lot of it's kind of intuitive, but I'll tell you a story. So I've mentioned Carlos Rodriguez Pastor a couple of times. He, his goal for his company is to really unlock growth in the middle class in Peru and serve middle class families. He had this realization that one of his greatest issues going forward in Peru was that a lack of educated customers and a lack of educated employees. At the time, Peru was dead last on the PISA rankings around education. And so, here's somebody who's running banks and retail malls and retail stores. And he decided he needed to create a new education system in order to intervene in the growth of the middle class in Peru. And so we worked together with him to create this incredible private school system called the Innova School System that's where the goal was to be world-class and ultra-low cost and scalable. Ultra-low cost was $150 a month, which is tiny compared to what we spend per student in America on schools. World-class meant bringing the best curriculum, the best teaching techniques into a system where they didn't have enough teachers. And so we created a blended learning technology and teaching approach, new styles of classrooms. We brought Saul Khan's Khan Academy down as part of the curriculum, and scalable with the idea of building many, many schools over time. That program now is, I think, more than 60 schools in Peru, spreading out to other countries in Central America. It's tripled the attainment scores in mathematics compared to the national average, and similarly in language. We just had, just a couple of years ago, had the first graduate of Innova Schools get accepted to study neuroscience at Stanford. And so that school system has been a highlight of his organization, but he did it because he wanted to change the system of growth of the middle class in Peru. And he recognized that designing a school system was a key leverage point. So I think that's really important. I think a second thing is you can't redesign systems unless you're not constantly curious about, systems are not something you can say, I have this point of view about it, and then, I kind of go away and I work on it. You have to be constantly studying it and have this sort of, this mindset that's about constant learning and constant discovery. And then finally, I think, and this is perhaps where one of the biggest challenges to innovating in systems is that systems, and I think you may have mentioned it a little bit earlier, they don't sit conveniently inside existing organizations, right? I mean, they cut across, whether it's, if you're talking about the system of a company, then it cuts across between departments. If you're talking about a societal system, it cuts across between business and government and civic society. And so the only way we get to innovate at that level is by bringing people together, through convening, through establishing new kinds of coalitions. And so we need coalition builders to be successful at innovating in systems. And my great example there is, and you mentioned it earlier on, Gary, about plastics in oceans. So Ellen MacArthur, this world famous single-handed sailor who went around the world, the youngest woman to sail around the world single-handedly, came back from that trip realizing that she wanted to do something about sustainability and built the Ellen MacArthur Foundation to focus on the circular economy, and has done an incredible job of creating these huge coalitions of organizations in Europe, the US, and Asia to begin to kind of figure out how to shift from a linear economy to a circular economy. So I think convening is an incredibly important part of this systems change process.
Those points there, Tim, are so important. Thank you for that. Look for the leverage point. There will be one that gives you more progress quicker, that unlocks a lot of other things. The point about bringing literally new thinking and trying not to be overly constrained, and then you got to convene. You got to build a community. You have to bring people together around that problem. And we're out of time, but I would encourage people, get Tim's book, get Change by Design, because the challenge you lay out there, Tim, I think it is the challenge for our time, right? How do we raise our creativity, our problem solving capabilities to match the kind of challenges we face today? And the world is filled with both peril and promise, but the proportion depends on whether we're able to go tackle these new challenges in front of us. So I mean, thank you for your leadership on this. Thank you for the wisdom, Tim. It's been a delight as always to talk to you.
It's been a great pleasure. We always have great conversations. I think the work you're doing is essential if the work that I'm doing has any chance of having impact. So let's continue to talk. But thanks so much. It's been a great pleasure.